Okay, so hello, this is Dylan Cummings for Rollt.Magazin here with Joey Johnson. Joey, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. It's been really busy the last couple of days, but yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Excited to talk to you about this, shall we say, interesting topic to say the least. So, yeah.
That's how we'll label it. Interesting.
Yeah. So to start off with, I'd just like to ask, how are you feeling about the situation, and then why you feel this certain way?
Well, I think the viewers or readers of Rollt kind of know my feelings on the situation. I haven't been quiet about it. I think it's a travesty for many reasons, but the reasons I would like to focus on in the immediate are basically the abuse of the athletes that's taken place. These athletes have dedicated years leading up to this year for Tokyo, and to be told basically year of that they are no longer welcome or eligible or able to compete at the Tokyo Games, it's a shame. So the way I feel, yeah, I'm mad, I'm upset, I'm heartbroken. I feel for those athletes, and I think it's a shame.
Yeah, definitely, and I think a lot of the wheelchair basketball community would agree with you on that. Following up on that, how would you define, what's your definition and your opinion of disability?
Well, it's a bit of a tricky question. I'm no medical doctor by any means, and I've never been trained to classify athletes or anything like that. But with that being said, I think anyone who has a lower limb impairment should be qualified or should be classified to compete in wheelchair basketball. And I believe that the IWBF or wheelchair basketball in general had the steps in place to ensure that anyone who was able to compete at the Paralympics in the past met those classification needs or guidelines. It's not that anyone pulled the wool over anyone's eyes and snuck in able-bodied athletes. There's medical documents that have to be seen. There's a whole, not only do you have to be classified internationally, but you'd have to be classified nationally within your own national organization first. So I don't know where the confusion would be. It's everyone who competed in any past Paralympic Games met the requirements of having a quote unquote disability to compete.
Yeah, and like you say, it does seem slightly confusing that previous athletes that met those requirements to compete in the Paralympics are now being classed out. That being said, this new IPC classification rule, the document that I have was published in 2016. So these quote unquote eligibility requirements have been valid since at least 2016. Sorry, I'll restart the question. So
yeah, no worries.
So the eligibility requirements that I've the document we've attached with our Rollt interviews has been at least been viewable since 2016. So obviously this change in the code happened in 2016. So why do you think it's taken this long for these new requirements to be brought into the sport now?
Well, that's a great question. I've also heard that like the code changed in 2015 is what I've been told. And I can't say I really blame the athletes for not being up to speed on things, because they've got other things going on in their lives. They're the ones that are training on court, trying to prepare for the games and stuff. But I blame the administrators at multiple levels here. Like IWBF, I think, has dropped the ball in not sharing this message that they would have received from IPC at that time to prepare the countries and the athletes for this day, basically. Why it's happened, I don't know. There's been a lack of communication somewhere along the way. But as I've said in other interviews in the past, it shouldn't be the athletes that pay the price for administrators dropping the ball.
Yeah, my apologies. This classification code did come into effect in 2015. But like you say, you said, quote unquote, that you think IWBF dropped, quote unquote, dropped the ball with this. Some athletes have come out and said, and IWBF have said themselves, that they've always tried to protect their classification philosophy that they have. And some athletes have also reiterated that point. So I think it's fair to say that IWBF have been working behind the scenes to try and come to an agreement with the IPC, but unfortunately they haven't been able to. So what's your opinion on IWBF trying to protect their philosophy and come to an agreement with the IPC?
Well, I really respect the IWBF if that's the case of trying to protect their philosophy, and I believe in their philosophy, that the inclusion part of it. Where I think they kind of dropped the ball is communicating that to their general population of athletes and national bodies that are members of IWBF. I do believe in 2015, when IPC would have told IWBF about this classification change, if they would have approached all their members as a community of wheelchair basketball coaches, athletes, and administrators, we could have come up with something better. Even if that means if we don't fit into the IPC's vision of what the Paralympic Games are, then maybe it's time that we leave that and start something different, whether it's another world championship. We do world championships every 2 years, or opening up wheelchair basketball for all people, able bodies as well, with the right classification system. I truly believe that could work. And then maybe we become an Olympic sport as opposed to a Paralympic sport. I think those ideas are out there, and I think that we have enough intelligent people within our sport that answers could have been given, but no one knew about this except for the IWBF board members who were told about it. And from my understanding, the only reason athletes found out about this even as early as late 2019 were a couple of athletes from wheelchair basketball were at some athlete forum, and they caught wind of this, and then they approached IWBF to get clarity and clarification on what was going on. That's not good enough. You know, we shouldn't be finding this out from other athletes and other sports that knew about this before wheelchair basketball athletes knew about this.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say there that you think that wheelchair basketball could potentially be opened up to able-bodied athletes at the top level. Now, this was a question I was going to ask later on in the interview, but since you brought it up now, I'll mention it now. But as you know, as of right now, wheelchair basketball is a Paralympic sport, and a lot of the national teams that qualify for the Paralympics receive funding through because they are a Paralympic sport. That's how the majority of the federations receive funding. So if you then open up wheelchair basketball to able-bodied players at the top level, there is a very high chance that it will lose its Paralympic its status as a Paralympic sport, and thus lose its funding, so which would leave a lot of players and federations without money. So how would you feel if the sport was to lose its funding?
I think it would be a shame, because sport is sport, and the way I look at it is, you have your Paralympic funding and you have your Olympic funding. There's funding for amateur sports through governments. Every country kind of funds things differently, but if we can get people active, to me, it doesn't matter, your race, religion, whatever, ability, disabilities, getting people active is the key to a healthy lifestyle. So why would we not want to fund that? Like, why couldn't we write a proposal to governments to ask for funding? And like I say, I don't know what all the answers are here, but I think we do have enough intelligent people involved in wheelchair basketball that certain solutions can be figured out, as long as they're communicated and we know what's going on.
These certain solutions that you talk about, and again, sorry to put you on the spot here, but how would you personally figure these solutions out?
Well, I've always said I believe minimals belong in the game. I believe that the sport is a sport, and I believe you've quoted me in the past as saying that if you have a wheelchair, you find a court and find a ball, you can go play. And the classification system creates that balance, the level playing field. If you want to change the classification system so that, if you don't have a disability, if you're able-bodied, that you're a 5-point player, I would be okay with that to start. But to me, there's no difference of a guy with, a single leg amputee below the knee and an able-bodied person sitting in the chair. If anything, that single leg amputee might have an advantage because he's got less weight under his chair. He can turn quicker. He's got a faster first push. So maybe we should penalize them for, make them a 5-point player and make the ABs a 4-point player. The other reason I believe ABs should be playing our sport is that it's not a sport for everyone. If you open it up to ABs, you're not going to get a swarm of 5 million people all of a sudden trying to play wheelchair basketball, because they have a lot of other options out there. The reason I like it, though, is so as a child, when I was growing up with a disability and the able-bodied sport world was taken away from me because of my hip disease, wheelchair basketball gave me a platform to continue competing with all my peers and my siblings even. Both my sister and my brother grew up playing wheelchair basketball. So I got to play a sport on an equal playing field with everyone that I cared to. And I love sharing that sport with them. And they grew up, loving the sport. My brother went on to become a national team coach. He became a world championship as a champion coach. My sister became an administrator with Adaptive Sport Association here in my local province. So I believe it's a sport that should be shared. And I believe the funding is out there, money is out there. We would just have to go out and find it and, support it that way.
Okay, that's interesting. And what would you say to the people who say that able-bodied people playing the sport at any level is taken away from disabled people?
I believe that's just an ignorant statement. I don't think they're speaking from any statistical point of view. I don't think they're speaking from anything other than almost a pitying point of view that this person with a disability needs more opportunities than someone who's able-bodied. I can speak from my experience, and here in Manitoba where I grew up, we always allowed able-bodied participation, and I believe it's created more opportunities for me. If I went to training and we only relied on our disabled population for athletes, we might have 4 or 5 athletes come out to a training session. Because we opened it up to able-bodied athletes, we would have upwards of 15, 20, 25 athletes come out to our practices. That enabled me to challenge myself against other players in a wheelchair. That enabled me to push myself, become better, to go on and have quite a successful international career. Without the able-bodied participation, I don't know if I would have had those opportunities. I don't know if I would have developed the passion that I have for wheelchair basketball if I had to go out and play 2-on-2 or 1-on-1 every week at practice. I might have just, grown tired of the sport, because wheelchair basketball is a team sport. That's a part that I really, really enjoy about wheelchair basketball, is that you're working on the court with 4 other people against 5 other people. And the best team always wins in the sport of wheelchair basketball. You could have the best player on the other side of that court, and if you have 5 guys that know how to work together and achieve a common goal, you can beat that one best player every time.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting viewpoint that you bring up. And it's interesting that you say that yourself, when you were younger, playing against able-bodied players, drove that competitiveness within you. Just going back onto the subject of disability, and I think the controversial question here, but do you think disability is subjective? Like, for example, what you define as a disability, or what federations or governing bodies or whoever define as a disability may differ from what other people define as a disability?
Yeah, I do. Once again, I'm not a medical doctor, so all these definitions of what a disability is, you could probably debate that till, the cows come home. But I think IWBF had it right for the last few years, and it's kind of a moving piece. It's always going to be tweaked over time. But the inclusion of minimal disabilities into the highest standard of wheelchair basketball, I think only helped the sport grow. As I said, it's not that they just opened it up to anyone in the past. You have to be classified to compete internationally. Some countries allow able-bodied participation at their national level, but if you wanted to compete internationally, IWBF had their process in place where you needed to be classified. And like I said, you got classified in your home country, then you'd have to go to an international tournament and be classified by the international classification committee. So it's not, to me, it's not even a gray area. It's almost black and white. Like they had their vetting system in there. Now, what constitutes a disability? Then I guess that's where the gray area comes in, because it is subjective. But I think IWBF for the last few years had it right, and they were allowing, the right athletes onto the court.
Yeah, and just following on from that, as we talk about, different people's various definitions of disabilities, what's your opinion on the current IPC's definitions of eligible impairments?
Well, I kind of philosophically disagree with it, obviously, because it's starting to exclude players from the sport that I have a passion for. And as I said, though, the IPC runs the Paralympic Games. I guess it's really up to them what they want to see in there. I'm just hoping that through enough players and coaches and administrators in the wheelchair basketball side of things, we can break down those views that IPC have of what a disability is in wheelchair basketball. It's tough because, as you said, disability can be kind of subjective. George Bates is a classic example, and now he's being excluded. But I got to coach him for a couple of years there, and the guy walks around with a crutch. Like, how's he going to play the running game of basketball? He's got a crutch. He can't go up and down the court. How's he going to play soccer? How's he going to do any sport in the able-bodied world? He can't. And now the disability sport or adaptive sport's been taken away from him as well. So he's just on the outliers there. He's in no man's land as far as continuing his athletic dreams.
Yeah, and I think that's the argument people are really up in arms about, is that if he's been, because to my knowledge, George Bates has been told by various doctors that he is much like this. Like you told me this before as well, that you were told by a doctor that when you had your injury, you were physically unable to play any able-bodied sport. So if you've been told by a medical professional that you're unable to play able-bodied sport, and now you're being told by the IPC that you're not eligible to play the disability sport at the highest level, where are you meant to go? And it's just
exactly.
That's what people are really frustrated about. You mentioned about breaking down those barriers and breaking down those views that the IPC has of disability. Again, sorry to put you on the spot, but how would you do that? If someone gave you the platform to speak to the IPC and break down those views, how would you do that?
Well, I think the only way I can do it is through my experience, and I would share to them what it was like when I was 8 years old and I got my hip disease, like calf perthes in my right hip. And I remember going to the doctor, and I was very active as a child, and ice hockey was the sport that I played a lot of. And I was at a summer camp, and I started having pain in my hip. It was a hockey camp I was at. And I went to the doctor, and I remember sitting in the doctor's office just thinking I'd pulled a muscle or whatever. And when he told me I had this disease called leg perthes, the first question out of my mouth was, well, when can I get back on the ice and play hockey? And he kind of like shook his head and like, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen for you. And my world came crashing down on me, because that's all I ever wanted to do was play sport. And then when my parents found adaptive sport for me, and I started going out and finding other kids with similar disabilities and disabilities that are way different than mine. But when we sat in that chair and we were playing games together, whether it was tag or, British Bulldogs, or we were just throwing a ball back and forth together. We were all the same out there. We were just a bunch of kids playing kids games together adaptively in a wheelchair. So I would have to share those kinds of stories with IPC, in that when I found wheelchair basketball or adaptive sport at that time, it, I would say, saved my life. It was life-changing, life-altering for me, in that it enabled me to feel like a kid again, a whole kid, not just a special, you're a disabled kid over here, but it enabled me to compete with and just compete. I say compete, but it could be just friendly games, just mucking around, playing around with other kids. So that really affected me in my childhood. And now, as I'm older, I can share a story. I was just a few months ago, got an email from a lady who told me that her son, she's down in the U.S. Somewhere, and she wrote me an email and just said that she found me on Facebook, and that her son had just been diagnosed with Legg-Perthes. Very devastating for the family. And then so they kind of Googled Legg-Perthes, and my image came up. So they did a little bit more research, and they found out that I played wheelchair basketball. I went to the Paralympics. I'm in multiple Hall of Fames and stuff now. And this is giving that kid a passion now, that he's starting to play wheelchair basketball locally. And his dream is now to go to the Paralympics because he found out about my story. It would be heartbreaking for me to think that that opportunity could be taken away from that child that's finally found a platform, an outlet that he can compete at. And if he doesn't meet one of those 10 requirements or classifications that IPC has, that he wouldn't have an opportunity to compete at the Paralympics.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you say that wheelchair basketball essentially saved your life. I can relate to that as well, and I'm not even coming at this from a minimal disability perspective. I'm classed as a 1, so I'm in wheelchair basketball terms. I'm classified as the most disabled. I can't think of another way to put it, but the most disabled category or classification that there is, and it certainly saved my life coming from a rural area in Scotland where I was the only disabled kid in mainstream school. So certainly saved my life. And it's gone out of my head. Sorry, it's completely gone blank. And I think that this is another issue that people are missing. For example, Annabelle Lindsay from Australia, who's another athlete that's been outclassed. She suffered a career-ending able-bodied basketball injury. She's already been through the process of thinking her career is over once when her able-bodied career ended, and then it's come out today that she's now ineligible for wheelchair basketball. And I think a lot of some critics of this, some people that believe that the rules are the rules, and I've had messages from people saying the rules are the rules, people should just abide by them, and these players that have been ruled non-eligible should just move on and find something else. It's hard when you've been told that your career is over, not just in able-bodied sport, but in disability sport now as well. It's hard to get yourself motivated to wake up in the morning and find the motivation to go and do something else. And I think mental health is going to be a big impact of how these athletes. This decision is going to impact these athletes that have been affected, their mental health. And I think I do really hope that they get the support they need, because obviously nowadays mental health is becoming a big issue, especially in young people.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think every athlete kind of prepares for, I would say, the end at some point. But usually it's either their choice through retirement, or you get cut because your skills just aren't good enough, whether they declined or you just weren't good enough in the first place to make a national team. But to have that ability, that choice of ending your career on your terms, whether it's, like I said, being not selected, but at least you gave it your all and you were out there trying to make that team. But to have some administrators just change the rules all of a sudden, move the goalposts on you midway through your training and say, okay, you're done. It's just not fair. And mental health, I can only imagine what those athletes are going through right now. And that's why I'm doing these kind of interviews, because I think it's very unfair and unjust.
Yeah, and I've said this before, but we really appreciate you for all the for coming forward and being so open and being able to speak about this. Just bringing it back to the IPC classification code. The code itself has been agreed upon by over 200 Paralympic sports governing bodies. And again, in your opinion, if this code has been so universally agreed upon by other sports, what made you think what makes you think that they gave this the green light?
That's a good question. I wasn't involved in any of those meetings or anything, so I kind of wish I would have been now in looking back. But so I don't know how it was presented or what the reasons were for wanting to move this way. I do think it's unfortunate, because I do think it's just ignorance in that it's tough to paint every sport or every adaptive sport or every Paralympic sport with the same brush. So to say that like this works for swimming, this works for track and field, this works for rugby, this whatever, it's tough to paint every sport with that same brush. Wheelchair basketball, in my opinion, is the most inclusive sport in the world. It provides, once everyone's sitting in that chair on a court, the chair is the great equalizer. That might not work for other sports. Like obviously, use blind sports for an example. You don't have one tool that can equalize the vision of everyone, or other track and field sports. There's a reason why at the Paralympics there's probably 50 different 100-meter races that go on, because you're not going to have single leg amputees running against quadriplegics that are pushing their wheelchairs, right? So they have to create so many different disciplines within that one event. But wheelchair basketball is different. You can take people with any lower limb impairment and put them in that chair. And from 1-pointers like yourself to 4-5s like myself, we need each other to be successful on a team. We have to learn how to work together as teammates to have that success. So it's a different sport. I think they have to look at each sport individually and see what's best for that sport. Under the umbrella of IPC, obviously, like if it doesn't fit their standards or whatever, then fair enough. If IPC doesn't think wheelchair basketball belongs there, then maybe we have to move on to greener pastures. But I do believe if they looked at it objectively, they would see that wheelchair basketball works as an inclusive sport, and it should be heralded that way. Like it should be praised, and how inclusive it is, where you have people with lower functions as 1-point players, but they work well with higher functioning players, because that's the nature of the sport. That's how you play the game.
So is it fair to say that you think the IPC should have a code, but instead of it being one code, the code should be separated for each Paralympic sport?
I would think that would work better, because each sport is so unique. It's very hard to generalize disabilities, as we've just talked about. Disabilities can be very subjective. So what works for one sport might not work for the other. What labels you use in one sport, it's definitely not going to work in the other. So if you look at each sport individually, I think you can create great opportunities for people of all disabilities within all of those disciplines and different disabilities.
And you've said today, and you've said in previous interviews, that once someone sits in a chair that's got a lower limb impairment, they're all equal. However, and again, this is just one of the arguments that's been presented to me against this, is that if you sit a blind person in a wheelchair, or a person in a wheelchair that's only got an upper limb removed, that they are not equal compared to the other players on court. So what would you say in response to this?
Well, IWBF's never had classification for blind people or people with just upper limb impairments. You always have to have that lower limb impairment. But I will say this. I know for a fact I've played against people with vision impairments. They weren't completely blind, obviously. But one guy in particular, when I was growing up, he played in Grand Forks, North Dakota in the U.S., and he wasn't even able to see the scoreboard on the sidelines. Like, that's how much his vision was impaired. And I know I have a handful of other people with vision impairments that have played wheelchair basketball in the past as well. And as far as upper limb impairments go, I mean, there are guys who are playing high-level wheelchair basketball. There's a guy in Argentina that's only got one arm, and he's arguably one of the best players on that court every time he steps out there. Couple guys in the UK that are playing right now that have missing digits or fingers or hands, and one in particular is the MVP of the world right now. So how do you? It's not a strong argument to me. Obviously, high performance sport, it's going to have its limits. High performance sports not for everyone, but at a recreational level, if someone wants to go out there and play, there will always be a court. If you want to go play pickup ball at any court in the world right now, as an able-bodied player, you could do that. To me, that's no different than in wheelchair basketball. The level of the game might vary because of the abilities of the athletes, but I truly believe if you're, have a wheelchair and a ball and are willing to go out there, you can do that. You have that opportunity to.
Yeah, but I think the argument people are trying to get at, like, say, for example, so the players that you were talking about that have hand impairments, they also have a lower limb impairment. But I think the argument that people say, so currently, if someone with just upper limb impairment, with no lower limb impairment, came to play wheelchair basketball, they wouldn't be, at this current moment, eligible to compete under IWBF rules. So, are you saying that the eligibility for IWBF rules should be changed, or what would you say in response to that?
Well, I go back to my kind of opening statement earlier, is that I believe the sport should be able to be enjoyed by everyone. So yes, I would open it up. I would let able-bodies play as long as people with disabilities. I don't care what your disability is. If you're missing a finger, if you're missing an arm, if you're missing a toe, you're missing a foot, if your spinal cord's wrecked, whatever it is, if you can sit in a chair, I think you have the right to play. Now, on the flip side of that, high-performance sports not for everybody. Just because you have a disability or just because you have the ability to sit in a chair does not guarantee you the right to compete at high performance. It's no difference than there's a reason there's only a handful of players that make the NBA every year. There's a reason there's only a handful of players that play professional soccer every year. But at a recreational level, absolutely. Open it up. Whatever your ability is, sit in a chair, and it levels the playing field. If you only have one arm, pushing a chair is going to be a lot more difficult. But like I said, use Pat Anderson as an example. He's got no legs below his knees. I believe that creates an advantage for him. He sits in his chair. He's got no weight underneath him. He can turn as fast as anybody out there. And he's one of the best players to ever play our game.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that the high performance sport is not for everyone. And again, this is another argument that's been presented to me, is that so recently IWBF Europe have announced that these these players that have been deemed non-eligible by the IPC are still eligible to play Euro Cup. Now, depending on what the arrangement that a player has with his club, they could end up still be getting paid by their club and still make a living out of wheelchair basketball despite not being eligible to play in the Paralympics. So, do you think that do you think that? Oh, sorry, I'm trying to get my words out because I don't want to miss word.
Don't worry about it.
Nothing. Sorry, I just need time to think because I don't want to say the wrong thing. Right, I'll restart again. So it's interesting that you say that not everyone will reach that top level of the sport. And another argument that's been presented to me is that that if players are still able to make a living out of the sport and still be able to get paid from the sport, for example, IWBF Europe announced that players deemed non-eligible by the IPC are still eligible to play Euro Cup. So if a player is still able to make a living out of the sport, are they really at a disadvantage, regardless whether they can play the Paralympics or not?
Well, yeah, they're at a disadvantage in the sense that they should be allowed to play at the Paralympics, in my opinion. Like, they should be able to go to the highest level. As far as those athletes that are able to make a living playing the sport, good for them. And I've always used this as an example. If you sit an able-bodied kid down in a chair and he wants to put in the thousands of hours it takes to train to become a high-performance athlete, not to mention all the other variables that go into going to represent your country at a Paralympics, if a kid is willing to do that, good for him. He should be allowed to go represent his country at the Paralympics, in my opinion. It doesn't happen that, the argument is, well, able-bodies are going to come in and start forcing all these disabled kids out of opportunities to go to the Paralympics. I don't believe that. If anything, I think it's going to push the kids with disabilities to become better. And I don't believe that we're going to have a million able-bodied kids lining up thinking, oh, I'm going to be the next great Paralympian, especially because they have so many more options out there. As far as athletic opportunities go. But to me, that doesn't, just because they have those options or opportunities, I don't think we should restrict them to, if a kid wants to go in, and I can attest to this through my career, you don't just sit in a chair and become a Paralympian. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that people that watch the Paralympics don't see. And that's thousands and thousands of hours in a gym, pushing your chair, working out, hitting shots. Yeah, so it doesn't happen. There's no magic potion that makes you a Paralympian. So.
And just to go back to the IPC code, sorry to keep going back and forth, but I just feel like as you bring up points, it's important to mention the questions I have around those points. But with the IPC code, you could argue that disability shouldn't be split into 10 subjective categories. However, there is no denying that the code covers a wide range, although not all, of disabilities. In your opinion, why should a wider range of disabilities be considered to be added to the IPC code?
Well, my opinion, the reason is, look what's happening in wheelchair basketball right now. We've had athletes training for years that are having their dreams shattered, their opportunities taken away from them because they're deemed not disabled enough or not having the right disability. That's the reason right there that the code does not work.
Yeah, and then another argument against that would be that these, for example, some conditions that the athletes are getting outclassed, and this doesn't go for every athlete, but for some athletes, their impairment is listed as a health condition, and although it causes a permanent physical impairment, it's like legally or lawfully not classed as a disability. So, like you said, it's a very specific case-by-case basis. For example, some health conditions can lead to serious permanent physical impairments, and other health conditions can lead people to just be fine. And so how do you think the in your opinion, why should the IPC at least take into consideration the health conditions that can lead people to experience permanent physical impairment?
Well, once again, it's because each sport is unique. So we're dealing with wheelchair basketball here. I think our governing body for wheelchair basketball, IWBF, should set those standards. Now, if IPC doesn't like those standards, yeah, maybe they have the right to kick us out of their games, but I think they're missing out on having some elite athletes with impairments compete at the games then. You can't judge every sport that's at the Paralympics the same. It's not an equal playing field. Wheelchair basketball had its rules and regulations. They did their due process to vet every athlete that competed in wheelchair basketball. And at the time, all these athletes that have been deemed ineligible now, and I've been told we're upwards of 9 athletes that have been deemed ineligible, and some are still under review. So, yeah, that's too many. One is too many to kick out of the games, in my opinion, especially after they've been already deemed eligible by our own governing body.
Yeah, at this current moment, 9 players have been deemed ineligible. Right. 4 players are currently under review, and 2 players have pulled out of the entire process. However, 119 out of 132 have been deemed eligible for the games. Of 4.0/4.5 classification. And it's interesting that you say that you believe IWBF should set the rules that they think. Well, no, not sorry. That IWBF should set their own rules, and it would then be up to the IPC whether they keep us on or let wheelchair basketball go from their games. Another argument to go against that would be that if like the wheelchair basketball would be a big loss to the Paralympics, but at the end of the day, the Paralympics would just continue as they are. But a lot of people think that wheelchair basketball wouldn't be the same without the Paralympics. What would you say to those people?
Well, I disagree wholeheartedly with that. I can speak from my days of playing professionally in both Australia and in Germany. People would always ask me if they'd find out I'm Canadian, like, oh, what are you doing here? And I would tell them I play wheelchair basketball. And usually their first thought is one of sympathy, like, oh, that's good that you get to do something, basically. And I tell them, no, just come out and watch a game, and I'd get them a ticket. And especially when I was in Wetzlar in Germany, and these fans would come out and watch their first ever wheelchair basketball game, and they would see the environment in that sports hall, and then they would see the product that's on the court. And I've never met anybody who's seen a high-level game of wheelchair basketball and walk away disappointed. If anything, they go in there with kind of a cautious attitude, like, oh, I'm here to watch a bunch of people play wheelchair basketball, and they leave, and it's like, holy crap, that was amazing. You guys are falling out of your chairs. You're shooting 3. Can I get another ticket for next week? I got to bring my other friend. He's got to check this out. So I think wheelchair basketball, especially if it's marketed correctly, and there are a handful of organizations in the world, and I'll use RSV Londil as an example because I was a member of their program for many years. When marketed properly, wheelchair basketball would be fine on its own. And going back to what I initially said about it, maybe wheelchair basketball leaves the Paralympics and we have world championships every year or every other year or whatever. I think we can market ourselves well, and I think we can attract good sponsorships, and I think we could attract true fans that would follow the sport year-round throughout the world.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. Like, it's really because I've been to the Londil Arena, and I've seen, like able-bodied fans like come and watch wheelchair basketball as a fan. Like in the UK, in other places that I've seen, you're lucky if you get family members, friends that come and watch. But
That's
right. In places like Germany, Londil in particular, there's an actual fan base. Turinga Bulls is another place.
But that didn't happen overnight either. I remember talking to the Nick Seltingers or Andreas Jonix, the people who started Londil, and talking about when they first got going, they would have 10, 15, 20 fans for games. But then they started marketing it, and they would get into the press, and they sold it as a sport. They didn't sell it as a disability sport. They didn't sell it as a sympathy thing, like, oh, these disabled people are on the court, come support them. They got out of the house today. This is good for them. They sold it as a sport, and that's what it is. It's a sport. And when people view it as a sport and treat it the way it should be, in my opinion, I think the product sells itself, especially at the highest levels. You look at the last few Paralympics and World Championships, on both the men's and women's side, we've had some of the best sporting moments And I would put that out there with any able-bodied sport. It's been fantastic basketball to watch. So I don't know of anyone who's a sports fan, especially a basketball fan, that would look at this product and think, oh, this is crap. I never want to watch this again. It doesn't happen. I've never met anyone who's ever said that watching a wheelchair basketball game at the highest level.
And it's interesting that you say that if marketed properly, you think wheelchair basketball could be a sport on its own. That being said, no, this isn't a question I've wrote down. But it's something someone has said to me beforehand. Obviously, the way the game is now with the 14 points on court and lower classes working with bigger classes, and obviously it's more of people use a lot of mid-pointers now in the game today, and obviously the teams are working together. But do you think there is an opportunity to have different versions of the game? For example, an open class sport where it doesn't matter about the classification. For example, a section of the sport where it's just for people with cerebral palsy or just for people with that have paraplegia. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it could happen that way, but I truly believe that the all-inclusiveness from a recreational level on up really can work. The people who want to be high-performance athletes, I think, understand that it's not a given. They got to put the time and energy in. And I've met tons of athletes throughout my career here that are just content on going out once a week, but playing with their buddies. They got a couple friends and they just want to go, and that's no different than the able-bodied world. I don't know if we would have the numbers to break down the sport into 10 different categories. Like, okay, this is for amps, this is for, minimals, this is for, cerebral palsy. I don't know if we have those kind of numbers of disabled people in our world that are interested in basketball. So that might be challenging, but with the proper classification system, and I do think we need to work on that, but that's an internal sport thing. I think there are some athletes, I wouldn't say that are misclassed, but we need to fine-tune what our classification system is from 4 or 5 all the way down to 1s.
Yeah, because there has been a few cases internally, not at the international level, but certainly at grassroots level, where certain people have been potentially misclassed. And I get another argument that I get. This relates to the different definitions of disability. Sorry to keep going off topic and then coming back, but I think
don't worry about
it. This discussion has been really interesting for sure. But for example, so different countries have different definitions for disabilities. For example, obesity is classed as a disability in the UK. So with that in mind, should anyone that has a defined disability in their country be eligible to play in the Paralympic Games, regardless of how their country defines disability?
Well, I think that's kind of the issue, is that in my world, you wouldn't have to have a defined disability to play. We have a classification system, and in the UK, if obesity is classified as a disability, then what better way to help combat obesity than get people active, get them out there playing any sport that we can. But as far as the way we have been doing it is in the IWBF, I would leave that to the classifiers, and I believe IWBF's done a good job in training classifiers to figure out which athletes meet the standard that they had as far as what their disability was, and according to IWBF, what that definition is to them. But yeah, in my perfect world, let's not label people. Let's just say, hey, here's a sport, you can play it. You have a disability, great, go play it. You have a friend that's able-bodied, he can go play with you. You got a friend that's missing a leg, well, bring him out as well. You guys can all go play wheelchair basketball.
Yeah, and just to clarify, you would extend that philosophy for all levels of the game.
If I had my way, I would, absolutely.
Okay, and I suppose the final question I have for you is, if you had the chance to speak to the head of the IPC face to face, what would you say to them, and how would you put forward an argument to get them to consider changing their classification code?
Well, I would say that I think a mistake has been made. And if you go into social media in the last few days, you will see that there are literally thousands of people that disagree with the decision that's been made. How I would go about trying to change his mind is, as I said before, I would try and share my stories and hoping that that education would bridge the gap that IPC and in particular Andrew Parsons is having with wheelchair basketball as far as our classification system goes. There's some athletes that can walk into the gym, but they have a disability as defined by IWBF standards and rules. So I would hope that through my stories and anecdotes that I could help enlighten him to the way our sport is, and hopefully be able to change his mind.
And just to continue on from that, an idea that's been brought to mind recently is that somebody said to me that there should be a clause within the IPC code that if anyone doesn't fall in within those eligibility requirements, there should be a process for them to prove how their disability / condition / impairment causes them physical permanent pain. What would you say in response to that?
I would support that, but I would go back to the statement I made before. I believe IPC needs to get rid of these blanket classifications for all sports because all sports are different. They need to look at each sport individually and come up with classification codes for each sport that they want to have involved in the Paralympics. And then you wouldn't have to have these escape clauses as far as, well, this person could meet your criteria. It would be just based on the sports criteria.
That seems like a very logical and sensible step to take going forward. But whether it will happen, I don't know. I just hope that the more we keep talking about it and the more we bring awareness to these issues, that hopefully at least some sort of change is made. At this point, I'd like to thank you for your time. And not only for this interview, but for helping Rollt throughout this whole process. So your several interviews before, like I've said, the very first interview you've done with us was, at the time, Rolt's most read interview ever. So thank you very much for doing that. And of course, this today. Before we wrap up here, is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't covered or touched on, or any final thoughts?
I would just like to thank you guys again, Rollt. I love the fact that you guys have created a platform for wheelchair basketball athletes, coaches, administrators, whatever, to have a voice and to be able to spread that voice a little bit. I appreciate your guys taking the time to do these interviews, especially with myself, because I do have some thoughts and concerns about our sport, and I appreciate you giving me the ability to get my voice out there. And to everyone else that's listening to this, let's keep fighting the good fight, and hopefully we'll get these players back into the Paralympics.
Yeah, and before we sign off here, I'd just like to publicly say that, again, if any current or former athlete or coach wants to come forward and speak about this issue, that Rollt is happy to provide a platform for that. All you have to do is message me. I have messaged the athletes that have publicly come forward about becoming non-eligible, but for the athletes that have not yet come forward, I've respected their privacy. And anyone that wants to come forward and talk about the situation, please just message me, and we'll continue to provide a platform for people who want to speak about this issue. Once again, Joey, thank you very much for your time, and I'll hopefully see you again soon.
You bet. Thanks a lot.